very briefly, I think it might benefit you if I give you a little bit of a context for Tanzania. So one, since most of you come from the extractive industry, Tanzania is predominantly a mining country. And, for many years, gold has been one of our major exports. And not until maybe 10, 15 years ago, is when we discovered gas. We don't have oil yet. Our colleagues from Uganda have oil, and Tanzania has been very kind to build a pipeline from Uganda to the coastal area of Tanzania, where the export terminal, or sort of the export terminal for the oil from Uganda, will be built. So that's a bit of a context. Now, in terms of our campaigns and our work around climate change and cutting down the emissions, Tanzania has, usually when I present this, I say it has a confusing sort of policy priorities, and I'll explain why. So recently, Tanzania increased its nationally determined contributions commitments, and we have an ambition to cut down our emissions up to 35% by 2030. Now, that's 5 years from now. But at the same time, Tanzania has a power system master plan, of which it explains how power generation and sources of energy, within Tanzania, where that energy will come from up to 2040. And if you look at that document, that sort of sets a vision between now until 2040. In 2040, Tanzania still expects to get some of its energy from coal, and some of its energy from gas as well. And that's 2040. But our commitment, as I said, to cut down the emissions as of 2030 is up to 35%. So you could see a little bit of a confusion between, those within the energy sector and those within, for example, within the environment sector. We, at the same time, want to cut down emissions, but at the same time, we do want to welcome new investment in fossil fuels, and we do want to continue to produce energy from fossil fuels. Now, the question would be, is that the only source of energy that we have in Tanzania, the fossil fuels? The answer will be no, because the recent research shows that from the renewable energy, the renewable energy potential for Tanzania is about 5 times the current energy demands that we have for Tanzania. And at the time, most of our energy, comes from gas. Part of it comes from coal, part of it comes from the biomass, and if you're based in urban areas, most of our energy goes through electricity that comes from hydropower. So even if we were to fully invest on renewable energies, we would produce 5 times as much the energy that the entire country needs. Now, our demand for energy increases partly because of the increase in population, but part because of the changing nature of economic activities as well. Now, the recent work that we are, as a coalition, we are working on was the liquefied natural gas project that is based in the southern part of Tanzania. Now, this is an investment by many firms, but being led by Equinor and Shell. Those are the 2 major key players on that particular project. Now, our work is based on the assumption that if we do want to keep our commitment to cut down the emissions by 2035, then Tanzania shouldn't be looking into new investment in fossil fuels. But 2, the argument by the leading companies for that liquefied natural gas project is that it will benefit Tanzania and it will increase energy security for Tanzania. But our recent work and our recent study shows that that is not true, because if more than 90% of that gas is going to be exported out of Tanzania, then it's not really for Tanzania's energy security. And even if that was the case, the investment that is being put forward on the liquefied natural gas project would otherwise be redirected to renewable energy sources that Tanzania has plenty and will produce as much energy that Tanzania needs. Now, if you're familiar with the political context, but also the civic space in Tanzania, the conversation around major projects such as the liquefied natural gas project, or even for our colleagues engaged in the East African crude oil pipeline project who are against it, it's not a very easy environment to be critical of major government projects. Now, for liquefied natural gas projects, we said we will take a different approach. So one, what we did was to undertake a study. I know there are many studies that have been done around liquefied natural gas projects and how that is not a complete solution to solve energy crisis, but also how that contributes to fossil fuel emissions. But we needed to do our own study in Tanzania, because if you were to run a campaign in Tanzania and you haven't done the research, or you haven't used the findings that have been compiled by a local institution, local organization, you usually get discredited very quickly and at the very early stages of your campaign. You will be told that you haven't done the research yourself. You don't even know what you're talking about. So as for us to be able to do that campaign, we said we will start talking to the policymakers here in Tanzania, but most importantly, to the communities that live around the area. And why I say we had to start with that stage, because it was a very important stage for us, because it did build an understanding even for us on how we want to engage. And I'll give you an example. So in the southern part of Tanzania's community, where the liquefied natural gas project will be built, those communities in that area have benefited from corporate social responsibility projects from Equinor and Shell for the past 10 years. So Equinor and Shell have built such a goodwill with that community that they're actually seen as very good companies. And again, nature of that community is not an area where you could talk about climate change impact or emissions and the community would be able to understand. But if you talk about how major projects might disrupt their livelihoods, for example, the liquefied natural gas export terminal that will be built close to the ocean, and that community depends most of the that area are fisher folks, are fishermen. And if you explain how that project is going to disrupt their way of life, then that's a language that you can sit down and talk to them and they would understand. This is not something that we had known before in terms of how to sort of get support from the community, because if we only had started our campaign from more of a climate change movement and cut down the emissions, we wouldn't even be able to get the support from the community. So we needed to understand how that community thinks and what major projects such as the one the liquefied natural gas project mean for them. So we did learn a lot from the community. So we did our first dialogue with the policymakers and members of parliament. And because we already had an understanding from the community, this time we took a very different approach. Instead of us speaking on behalf of the community and what we have found, we did facilitate a dialogue between the community and the members of parliament. And that was very important, again, because then this was a conversation not by NGO saying, why are you speaking for people that you don't even, live in the area, or people that you do not represent? So for us was more of a facilitator of a dialogue. We brought the communities and we brought the members of parliament, and the community could speak directly to the members of parliament. Now, it's, again, as I said, their presentation, their languaging isn't really against climate change. It's not this, it's not the high level dialogue that we usually have in these major, conferences or the conference of the parties, but you could listen to them and have the reason that even though they might not be able to explain what climate change is or what the global negotiations looks like, but they could explain the impact of these major projects and what that means for their livelihoods. And I think that's something that spoke to some of the members of parliament. And I say some because not every member of parliament was moved with the climate change, idea. And as you already know, there are still skeptics about climate change. And even even in Tanzania, it's not a very easy conversation with some of the policymakers, because the argument is our contribution to emissions is very small, and historically we haven't been the highest, the biggest polluters. And climate change is one of the Western agendas to make African countries not to develop. So we will not really believe that. So there are still those arguments as well. And as you campaign, you need to be able to, to counter such narratives, and be able to explain, that even if you're not the biggest polluter, but the effects are being felt everywhere, and especially in the developing countries. And that even though we might not have the same responsibilities like every other country, but there's something that we can do as a country.